On a freezing winter night, an eerie cry pierces the silence of a secluded forest, waking a lone man in his tiny cabin. Stepping outside, he encounters an astonishing sight, a massive bear and her three trembling cubs at his doorstep. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you are watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. On a freezing winter night, deep in the silence of a snow-covered forest, a strange and haunting sound echoed through the air. It wasn't the howl of the wind or the call of a wild animal. It was something different, something desperate. A lone man in a secluded cabin steps outside to investigate, only to find a massive bear standing on his porch. But this isn't a story about danger. It's a story about trust, survival, and the unexpected bond that changes both their lives forever. What could bring a wild bear to a human's door? And what he discovers next will leave you questioning everything you know about the connection between man and nature. The icy wind howled through the towering evergreens of Olympic National Forest, rattling the single-pane windows of the small cabin tucked away in its depths. Inside, Jack Rivers sat hunched over his old wooden desk, its surface worn smooth by years of creative struggles. A black and white photo in a silver frame sat beside his stack of unfinished manuscripts. His wife, Clara, smiling with effortless warmth. Tonight, her image felt heavier than ever, an anchor pulling him further into the icy depths of his own isolation. The glow of the wood-burning stove flickered across the cabin walls, casting dancing shadows that did little to warm the room's atmosphere. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes descending onto the thick white blanket already covering the ground. Jack rubbed his hands together and stared at the blank page before him. He had been here for nearly a year, hiding from the world, searching for words he wasn't sure existed anymore. A sharp sound broke the silence. It wasn't the wind or the creak of the forest settling into the night. It was higher pitched, like a cry or sound that didn't belong here. Jack froze, his pen clattering to the desk. The cry came again, this time closer, a mournful wail carried on the cold night air. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, standing so quickly that his chair scraped the floor. His first instinct was to grab the flashlight he kept near the door. The sound continued, a chilling combination of sorrow and desperation that stirred something deep in his chest. Pulling on his thick parka, Jack stepped outside, the crunch of his boots on the snow barely audible over the wailing. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the forest's edge. His breath came in clouds as he strained to locate the source of the sound. For a moment, the only movement was the gentle fall of snowflakes. Then, just beyond the faint perimeter of his cabin's glow, a massive figure emerged from the shadows. Jack's flashlight caught it first, the shaggy, snow-dappled coat of a bear, standing on all fours. Its size and presence were staggering. Yet it wasn't the bear's bulk that routed him to the spot. It was its eyes, deep, dark pools glistening with unmistakable emotion. The bear let out another sound, a guttural moan that rose and fell like a lament. Jack's pulse quickened. He knew bears frequented these woods, mostly black bears, but this one was different. Its sheer size and thick brown coat marked it as a grizzly, a rare visitor this far south. The realization only added to the surreal nature of the encounter. Grizzlies were supposed to be fierce, dangerous, untouchable. Yet, as he stood there, Jack felt none of the instinctive fear he thought he should. The bear wasn't charging or growling. It wasn't threatening at all. Instead, it stumbled forward, favoring one of its front legs. Blood stained the snow beneath its paw, a stark red against the pristine white. The bear's head dipped low as if acknowledging Jack's presence. For a moment, he considered retreating inside. What could he possibly do for a wounded bear? He wasn't a vet or a ranger, just a rider who had abandoned his world for one he barely understood. But as the bear cried again, Jack felt something break inside him. "All right," he muttered, unsure if the bear could even hear him. "All right, don't move." Slowly, he backed toward the cabin, his eyes never leaving the bear. Once inside, he rummaged through a supply cabinet, pulling out a roll of bandages, a bottle of hydrogen peroxide, and an old first aid manual. His hands trembled as he stuffed everything into a canvas bag and grabbed a thick woolen blanket. When he stepped back outside, the bear was still there, its heavy breaths clouding the air. Jack approached cautiously, stopping a few feet away. "I don't know if this is a good idea," he said, his voice shaky, "but you look like you need help." The bear huffed softly but didn't move as Jack crouched down, holding the flashlight in one hand and inspecting the injured paw with the other. Deep gashes ran across its pad and up its leg, likely from a fight with another predator. "This is going to sting," he whispered, unscrewing the bottle of peroxide. The first splash elicited a low growl, and Jack jerked back, heart hammering. But the bear stayed still, watching him with eyes that seemed to understand. The process took longer than it should have, Jack's hands fumbling with the bandages in the freezing cold. But eventually the wound was cleaned and wrapped. He draped the blanket over the bear's back, unsure if it would even help, and stepped back. "There," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "That's the best I can do." The bear looked at him for a long moment, its eyes reflecting the dim light of the cabin. Then, to Jack's astonishment, it lowered its head in what could only be described as gratitude, before retreating into the shadows. Jack stood there long after it had gone, the weight of the encounter settling over him like the falling snow. For the first time in months, he felt something stir inside him, not sadness, but something quieter, warmer, hope. He turned back to his cabin, the silver frame on his desk catching the firelight as he closed the door behind him. Somewhere in the forest, the bear's cry faded into the night. The morning broke slowly over the snow-draped wilderness, the pale sun casting a feeble glow over Olympic National Forest. Jack Rivers sat by his window, nursing a steaming mug of black coffee. The rhythmic creak of his rocking chair filled the silence as his gaze wandered across the untouched snow outside. It was as though last night's events had been a dream, yet the faint crimson trail near the edge of the trees told a different story. He thought about the bear, the sheer size of it, its wounded paw, the desperate cries that had pulled him outside in the dead of night. He thought about its eyes, most of all. They had been soulful, expressive in a way that unsettled him. It was as if the creature had been pleading for help, not just physically, but for something deeper. "Jack, you're crazy, Rivers," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "It's a bear, not a neighbor." Still, he found himself reaching for his boots and the thick green parka he kept by the door. He tucked a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a few protein bars into his jacket pockets, along with the same first aid supplies he'd used the night before. It wasn't much, but it felt better than heading out unprepared. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped outside, the air crisp and biting against his skin. The morning was still, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the pines. Jack followed the faint trail of blood leading into the forest, his breath visible in the cold air. The deeper he ventured, the quieter the world became. The towering evergreens formed a cathedral-like canopy above him, their branches heavy with snow. Jack's senses sharpened, his ears straining for any sound beyond his own movements. He wasn't sure what he hoped to find, or if he even wanted to find it. After about half an hour of trudging through the snow, he spotted something unusual. A patch of disturbed earth lay at the base of a large cedar tree, its roots forming a hollow that provided some shelter from the elements. Jack crouched down, his breath catching when he noticed the unmistakable paw prints leading into the hollow. The bear was there. Its massive body was curled protectively around something, or rather someone's. 3 small shapes were nestled against its side, their fur barely visible beneath the blanket of snow. Cubs. The realization hit Jack like a wave, explaining everything: the bear's cries, its desperation to approach him. He took a cautious step closer, his heart pounding. The bear's head lifted immediately, its dark eyes locking onto his. It didn't growl or rise to its feet, but its posture stiffened. A clear warning. "I'm not here to hurt you," Jack said, his voice low and steady. He wasn't even sure why he was talking. It wasn't as if the bear understood, yet something about speaking aloud made the moment feel less surreal, more manageable. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." The bear watched him for a long moment before lowering its head again, its exhaustion evident. Jack crouched down, careful not to move too quickly. From this angle, he could see the cubs more clearly. 3 tiny bundles of fur huddled against their mother. They were so small, so vulnerable, and his chest tightened at the sight. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he murmured, more to himself than to the bear. He reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the protein bars, unwrapping it slowly. "I don't know if you can eat this, but it's better than nothing." He tossed the bar gently onto the ground a few feet away, watching as the bear sniffed the air. After a moment, it stretched its neck toward the bar and picked it up with surprising delicacy. It wasn't much, but it felt like an offering, an unspoken truce. Jack stayed crouched there for what felt like hours, watching as the bear nuzzled its cubs and settled back into the hollow. There was something almost sacred about the scene, a raw display of nature's resilience that left him humbled. When the cold began to seep through his layers, Jack finally stood, his legs protesting the movement. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said softly, though he wasn't sure why he felt compelled to make the promise. "You're not alone." The bear didn't react as he turned to leave, its head resting on its paws once more. Jack retraced his steps through the snow, his mind racing. He had come out here to escape, to isolate himself from the world and the pain it brought. Yet somehow, in the span of 24 hours, a wounded bear and her cubs had pulled him back into the fold of connection. Back at the cabin, Jack placed the remaining protein bars on the counter and started a list of supplies he would need: more food, blankets, anything to help the small family survive the winter. For the first time in months, his thoughts weren't consumed by his own grief. For the first time, he felt a spark of purpose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow, Jack sat down at his desk. The blank page before him no longer felt daunting. He picked up his pen and began to write, the words flowing as naturally as the falling snow. In the corner of his desk, Clara's photo caught the warm glow of the firelight, her smile no longer feeling like an anchor, but a beacon. The days that followed felt different. The icy grip of winter remained, but something inside Jack Rivers had begun to thaw. He couldn't explain it, not even to himself, but every morning he found himself drawn back to the hollow beneath the cedar tree where the grizzly and her cubs had claimed refuge. He prepared carefully each time, packing food, extra blankets, and even a battered thermos filled with warm water he thought might help. His steps along the snowy trail became more familiar with each trip, the cold air biting less as his body adjusted to the routine. On the fourth day, Jack stood at the edge of the hollow again, clutching a small bundle of dried meat he'd found in his pantry. He knelt slowly, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Hey girl," he said softly, his voice no longer hesitant but steady, like a familiar melody. He had started talking to her as though she understood, the act of speaking filling the silences that had once consumed him. "I brought you something better than protein bars this time." The bear he had named her Luna in his mind, though he wasn't sure why, lifted her head. Her dark eyes met his, not with the same wary sharpness as before, but with something closer to acknowledgement. Her wound, still wrapped in the makeshift bandage he'd applied, seemed to be healing. The dried blood had flaked away, leaving clean fur around the edges. He set the bundle of meat on the snow, a safe distance away, and stepped back. Luna sniffed the air before stretching her neck out toward the offering. Her massive paws shifted carefully, as though she didn't want to disturb the cubs pressed close to her side. Jack's gaze fell to the cubs. They were tiny, fragile things, their brown fur a patchwork of fluff and vulnerability. One of them stretched a paw lazily, brushing against Luna's leg, while another nuzzled closer, seeking warmth. The smallest of the three, barely larger than a house cat, opened its eyes briefly, glancing in Jack's direction before settling back into its siblings. "They're beautiful," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind that rustled the branches above. "You've got your hands full, don't you?" Luna finished the meat quickly and settled her head back on her paws, her gaze softening but never fully relaxing. Jack wondered how much she understood, how much of this tenuous exchange was instinct, and how much was something deeper. He stayed for a while longer, sitting on a nearby log, his presence a silent reassurance. Each visit was the same. He would bring food, watch the family from a respectful distance, and speak to Luna as though she were an old friend. Slowly, the tension in her posture eased. By the end of the week, she no longer flinched when he approached. One morning, Jack arrived with a new offering, a thick woolen blanket he had found tucked away in his storage trunk. The sight of the cubs shivering against their mother in the biting cold had stuck with him through the night, and he couldn't shake the guilt of returning empty-handed. When he reached the hollow, Luna greeted him with a soft huff, her eyes meeting his with what he imagined was a flicker of recognition. The cubs were more active now, tumbling over one another in playful spurts of energy before retreating to Luna's side when the cold proved too much. Jack crouched down, unfolding the blanket slowly. "This is for the little ones," he said, his voice calm. "I know you're doing everything you can, but maybe this will help." Luna tilted her head, watching as he inched closer. He paused just outside the hollow, draping the blanket over a patch of snow near the cubs. One of them, a bold little creature with a streak of lighter fur across its nose, approached cautiously, sniffing the edge of the blanket. Jack didn't move, his heart pounding as he watched the cub paw at the fabric. It pulled the edge toward itself, wriggling beneath it before collapsing into a tiny ball of fur. The sight made him. The wind began to howl late in the evening, an ominous precursor to the storm Jack had heard about on the crackling weather station earlier that day. Snow battered the windows of his cabin, the icy gusts sneaking through the tiniest gaps in the wooden walls. He had weathered storms here before, but this one felt different. He wasn't alone in its path, not really. Jack sat by the fire, staring at the dancing flames as shadows flickered across the room. His thoughts were with Luna and her cubs, exposed to the harsh elements in their hollow beneath the cedar tree. He had tried to convince himself that they'd be fine after all. They were wild creatures, adapted to survive the relentless winters of the Pacific Northwest. But something gnawed at him, a quiet voice, insisting that this storm was too much even for them. By midnight, the storm had intensified. The snow fell thick and fast, piling up against the cabin and erasing the world beyond his window. Jack paced the room, his boots scuffing the wooden floor. The roaring wind made it impossible to sit still. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, grabbing his parka and pulling it on over his sweater. He didn't bother with gloves or a hat. He wasn't planning to be out long. The cold hit him like a wall the moment he opened the door, the wind snatching it from his grasp and slamming it against the cabin. Snow swirled in every direction. Invisibility was reduced to mere feet. Jack squinted into the storm, pulling the hood of his parka tight around his face. The trail he had walked so many times was already buried beneath the fresh snow, but his feet knew the way. Each step was a battle, the wind threatening to knock him off balance as he trudged toward the cedar tree. The cold seeped through his layers, biting at his skin, but he pressed on, the thought of the vulnerable cubs driving him forward. When he finally remodeled the hollow, he almost didn't see them. The snow had drifted high around the base of the tree, and for a moment, panic gripped him. But then he heard a soft, muffled whimper, cutting through the roar of the storm. He dropped to his knees and began digging with his hands, ignoring the sting of the icy snow against his bare fingers. Within moments, he uncovered the entrance to the hollow. Luna's massive head emerged, her eyes wide and alert. She growled softly at first, but when she recognized him, the sound faded into a low huff. "It's all right," Jack said, his voice trembling from the cold. "I'm here to help." The cubs were huddled against Luna's side, their tiny bodies shivering beneath the blanket he had brought days earlier. Snow had begun to seep into the hollow, and it was clear that their shelter wouldn't hold much longer. Jack didn't hesitate. "I know you don't trust me completely," he said, more to himself than to Luna, "but you have to come with me. You'll freeze out here." He backed away slightly, giving Luna space as he motioned toward the path. She didn't move, her gaze shifting between her cubs and the storm raging outside. Jack could see the conflict in her eyes, the instinct to protect her young warring with her fear of the unknown. "Please," he urged, his voice breaking, "you have to trust me." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Luna rose to her feet. She nudged her cubs gently, coaxing them to follow her out of the hollow. The smallest one hesitated, its tiny paws sinking into the deep snow. But Luna turned and gave it a soft nudge, her maternal patience unwavering. Jack led the way, moving as quickly as he could while ensuring the bear family could keep up. The wind whipped around them, and more than once he had to stop and help clear a path through the drifts. Each time, Luna watched him closely, her eyes never leaving his movements. By the time they reached the cabin, Jack was trembling from the cold. He pushed the door open, holding it wide as Luna lumbered inside, her cubs trailing behind her. The sight of the massive grizzly in his small cabin was surreal, but he didn't care. He grabbed extra blankets from the closet, spreading them on the floor near the fire. "Here," he said, his breath still visible in the freezing air. "It's not much, but it's warm." Luna lowered herself onto the blankets, her cubs immediately curling up against her side. The firelight danced across her fur, highlighting the exhaustion etched into every line of her massive body. Jack sank into a chair nearby, his hands shaking as he poured himself a cup of coffee from the thermos he had left by the fire. For a long time, neither of them moved. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, the cabin was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the fire and the occasional whimper from the cubs. Jack watched as Luna closed her eyes, her breathing steady and calm for the first time since he'd found her. He leaned back in his chair, his own exhaustion catching up with him. He hadn't planned on this sharing his home with a bear and her cubs, but as he looked at the family nestled by the fire, he felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in months, the cabin didn't feel so empty. Morning crept into the cabin with the soft glow of sunlight filtered through frost-covered windows. The storm had passed, leaving a pristine blanket of snow outside that glittered under the pale light. Inside, the fire in the wood stove had dwindled to embers, casting a faint warmth that barely held back the chill, seeping through the wooden walls. Jack stirred in his chair, his neck stiff and his body heavy from an uneasy sleep. The faint rustling sound of movement brought him fully awake, his heart lurching as he remembered the events of the night before. He turned toward the corner of the cabin near the stove. There, stretched out on the blankets, lay Luna, her massive form rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. Her cubs were curled against her side, one of them wriggling closer to nuzzle into the thick fur of her belly. The sight was oddly peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of the storm that had brought them here. Jack exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool air of the cabin. He stood carefully, his movements slow and deliberate, so as not to startle his unexpected guests. His joints protested from the cold and the awkward position he had slept in, but he ignored the discomfort, his attention fixed on the bear family. Luna's eyes opened as he moved, her dark gaze locking onto his. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence between them heavy with unspoken understanding. There was no growl, no tension in her posture, only a quiet watchfulness that spoke of her trust in him, fragile but growing. "Morning," Jack said softly, his voice rough from sleep. "Guess we made it through the night, huh?" Luna huffed quietly, her head resting back on her paws. Jack took that as permission to go about his morning routine. He added a few logs to the wood stove, stoking the fire until it roared back to life, filling the cabin with much-needed warmth. The sound of crackling wood seemed to lull the cubs, who dozed peacefully despite the movement around them. Jack moved to the kitchen area, pulling open the small fridge that hummed faintly in the corner. Supplies were running low, a half-empty carton of eggs, a block of cheddar, and a loaf of bread that was starting to harden. He made a mental note to venture into town soon, though the thought of leaving the bears alone unsettled him. As he prepared a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, his mind wandered. He had spent the past years seeking solitude, convinced that isolation was the only way to cope with his grief. Yet here he was, sharing his small cabin with a grizzly bear and her cubs, and for the first time in months he felt a flicker of something other than pain. Purpose. He placed his plate on the table and ate in silence, occasionally glancing over at Luna. She watched him with quiet curiosity, her ears twitching at the sound of his fork scraping the plate. The cubs stirred, their tiny paws stretching as they began to wake. Jack set his plate aside and reached for the bundle of dried meat he had left on the counter. He tore off a few pieces and approached the bears slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "Breakfast," he said, placing the meat on the floor a safe distance from where they lay. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing." Luna sniffed the air, her nose twitching. She nudged one of the cubs, who clumsily stumbled forward to investigate the offering. The others followed, their small bodies awkward but determined. Jack couldn't help but smile as they nibbled at the meat, their soft grunts filling the cabin. "Good appetite," he murmured, stepping back to give them space. He leaned against the counter, watching as Luna finally joined her cubs, tearing into the meat with a delicacy that belied her size. The day passed slowly, the rhythm of the cabin shifting to accommodate its new inhabitants. Jack busied himself with small tasks, chopping firewood, tidying up the clutter that had accumulated over months of neglect. The bears watched him with varying degrees of interest, the cubs occasionally venturing closer before scampering back to Luna's side. By mid-afternoon, Jack found himself sitting by the fire, a notebook in his lap. The blank pages had mocked him for weeks, but today the words came easier. He wrote about the storm, about Luna and her cubs, about the strange and unexpected connection that had formed between them. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As he wrote, the smallest cub wandered closer, its curiosity outweighing its caution. It sniffed at his boot, its tiny nose cold against his leg. Jack froze, not wanting to scare it away. Slowly, he reached out his hand, palm up and open. The cub hesitated, its dark eyes studying him intently before leaning forward to sniff his fingers. Jack laughed softly, the sound surprising even himself. "You're braver than your siblings, huh?" he said, his voice low and warm. The cub let out a tiny huff before retreating to Luna's side, its bravery spent. That evening, as the fire crackled and the cabin filled with the golden glow of lamplight, Jack sat at the table, a steaming mug of tea in his hands. Luna was dozing on the blankets, her cubs piled around her like tiny furry satellites. The storm had left the world outside still and quiet, the snow absorbing every sound. For the first time in a long while, Jack didn't feel alone. The emptiness that had haunted him since Clara's death was still there, but it felt lighter, less oppressive. As he watched the bears sleep, he realized that they had given him something he hadn't expected. Hope. Hope that even in the harshest of winters, life could endure. Hope that even in the deepest solitude, connections could be forged. And with that hope came the faintest flicker of healing. Morning crept into the cabin with the soft glow of sunlight filtered through frost-covered windows. The storm had passed, leaving a pristine blanket of snow outside that glittered under the pale light. Inside, the fire in the wood stove had dwindled to embers, casting a faint warmth that barely held back the chill seeping through the wooden walls. Jack stirred in his chair, his neck stiff and his body heavy from an uneasy sleep. The faint, rustling sound of movement brought him fully awake, his heart lurching as he remembered the events of the night before. He turned toward the corner of the cabin near the stove. There, stretched out on the blankets, lay Luna, her massive form rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. Her cubs were curled against her side, one of them wriggling closer to nuzzle into the thick fur of her belly. The sight was oddly peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of the storm that had brought them here. Jack exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool air of the cabin. He stood carefully, his movements slow and deliberate, so as not to startle his unexpected guests. His joints protested from the cold and the awkward position he had slept in, but he ignored the discomfort, his attention fixed on the bear family. Luna's eyes opened as he moved, her dark gaze locking onto his. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence between them heavy with unspoken understanding. There was no growl, no tension in her posture, only a quiet watchfulness that spoke of her trust in him, fragile but growing. "Morning," Jack said softly, his voice rough from sleep. "Guess we made it through the night, huh?" Luna huffed quietly, her head resting back on her paws. Jack took that as permission to go about his morning routine. He added a few logs to the wood stove, stoking the fire until it roared back to life, filling the cabin with much-needed warmth. The sound of crackling wood seemed to lull the cubs, who dozed peacefully despite the movement around them. Jack moved to the kitchen area, pulling open the small fridge that hummed faintly in the corner. Supplies were running low, a half-empty carton of eggs, a block of cheddar, and a loaf of bread that was starting to harden. He made a mental note to venture into town soon, though the thought of leaving the bears alone unsettled him. As he prepared a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, his mind wandered. He had spent the past year seeking solitude, convinced that isolation was the only way to cope with his grief. Yet here he was, sharing his small cabin with a grizzly bear and her cubs. And for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of something other than pain. Purpose. He placed his plate on the table and ate in silence, occasionally glancing over at Luna. She watched him with quiet curiosity, her ears twitching at the sound of his fork scraping the plate. The cubs stirred, their tiny paws stretching as they began to wake. Jack set his plate and reached for the bundle of dried meat he had left on the counter. He tore off a few pieces and approached the bears slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "Breakfast," he said, placing the meat on the floor a safe distance from where they lay. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing." Luna sniffed the air, her nose twitching. She nudged one of the cubs, who clumsily stumbled forward to investigate the offering. The others followed, their small bodies awkward but determined. Jack couldn't help but smile as they nibbled at the meat, their soft grunts filling the cabin. "Good appetite," he murmured, stepping back to give them space. He leaned against the counter, watching as Luna finally joined her cubs, tearing into the meat with a delicacy that belied her size. The day passed slowly, the rhythm of the cabin shifting to accommodate its new inhabitants. Jack busied himself with small tasks, chopping firewood, tidying up the clutter that had accumulated over months of neglect. The bears watched him with varying degrees of interest, the cubs occasionally venturing closer before scampering back to Luna's side. By mid-afternoon, Jack found himself sitting by the fire, a notebook in his lap. The blank pages had mocked him for weeks, but today the words came easier. He wrote about the storm, about Luna and her cubs, about the strange and unexpected connection that had formed between them. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As he wrote, the smallest cub wandered closer, its curiosity outweighing its caution. It sniffed at his boot, its tiny nose cold against his leg. Jack froze, not wanting to scare it away. Slowly, he reached out his hand, palm up and open. The cub hesitated, its dark eyes studying him intently before leaning forward to sniff his fingers. Jack laughed softly, the sound surprising even himself. "You're braver than your siblings, huh?" he said, his voice low and warm. The cub let out a tiny huff before retreating to Luna's side, its bravery spent. That evening, the fire crackled and the cabin filled with the golden glow of lamplight. Jack sat at the table, a steaming mug of tea in his hands. Luna was dozing on the blankets, her cubs piled around her like tiny furry satellites. The storm had left the world outside still and quiet, the snow absorbing every sound. For the first time in a long while, Jack didn't feel alone. The emptiness that had haunted him since Clara's death was still there, but it felt lighter, less oppressive. As he watched the bears sleep, he realized that they had given him something he hadn't expected. Hope. Hope that even in the harshest of winters, life could endure. Hope that even in the deepest solitude, connections could be forged. And with that hope came the faintest flicker of healing. Jack awoke to a world blanketed in silence. The storm had passed days ago, but its aftermath lingered. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, glistening under the pale morning sun. It was a silence not of absence, but of suspension, as though the forest itself were holding its breath in the aftermath of the storm. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than it had in months, not just from the fire that crackled steadily in the wood stove, but from the presence of the bears. Luna lay sprawled on the blankets, her cubs snuggled close to her belly. Their soft breaths filled the room with a rhythm that Jack found strangely soothing. It was as if the storm had forged an unspoken bond between them, one built on trust and necessity. Jack stretched in his chair, his muscles stiff from another night of uneasy sleep. He glanced at the notebook on the table, its pages filled with scribbled notes and half-formed sentences. Writing had come easier since the bears had entered his life, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the sense of purpose they gave him, or the simple act of caring for another living being. Whatever it was, it felt like a lifeline, pulling him out of the void he'd been trapped in for so long. He stood and moved quietly to the kitchen, careful not to disturb the bears. He'd developed a routine over the past few days. Coffee for himself, a mix of dried meat and scraps for Luna, and whatever warmth he could provide for the cubs. He rummaged through the cupboards, noting how quickly his supplies were dwindling. Another trip to town was inevitable, but the thought of leaving them alone made his chest tighten. "Good morning," he said softly as he placed a small pile of food near Luna. Her ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and her dark eyes opened slowly. She watched him for a moment before stretching her massive body and rising to her feet. The cubs, still groggy, tumbled over one another in a sleepy attempt to follow. "You're getting used to this, aren't you?" Jack said with a faint smile. He stepped back as Luna approached the food, her movements slow and deliberate. The cubs sniffed at the pile, their tiny noses wrinkling as they examined the scraps. One of them, smaller than the others, with a streak of light fur across its back, let out a tiny grunt of approval before diving in. Jack chuckled. "You've got a little leader there." Later that morning, Jack ventured outside to clear the path leading from the cabin to the forest. The snow was heavy and the work was slow. But he didn't mind. The physical effort kept his mind focused, his muscles warm against the biting cold. As he worked, he caught movement from the corner of his eye. He turned to see Luna standing in the doorway of the cabin, her cubs peeking out from behind her massive frame. She watched him intently, her breath visible in the crisp air. "You curious?" Jack called out, leaning on his shovel. "Or just making sure I'm not up to something?" Luna huffed softly, her head tilting slightly. Then, to his surprise, she stepped forward, her cubs hesitating for a moment before following. Jack froze, unsure of what to do. The bears had rarely ventured outside since the storm, and he hadn't expected them to now. He stood still as Luna approached, her movements cautious but deliberate. She sniffed at the snow near his feet, her massive paws leaving deep impressions in the fresh powder. The cubs followed suit, their tiny bodies sinking into the snow with each step. Jack crouched slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "You're braver than I thought," he murmured, his voice low and even. He reached out a hand, palm up, offering no food or gesture, just presence. Luna sniffed the air near his hand, her breath warm against his skin. Her cubs circled around her legs, their curiosity outweighing their fear. One of them, the smallest, ventured closer, its tiny paw brushing against Jack's knee. He laughed softly, the sound carrying into the stillness of the forest. "You've got a lot of guts for someone so small." The cub tilted its head, its dark eyes studying him with an intensity that felt almost human. For a moment, the world around them seemed to fade, the silence of the forest broken only by the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. As the day wore on, Jack found himself returning to the cabin with the bears close behind. Luna settled by the fire, her cubs curling up beside her, their energy spent from their brief exploration of the outside world. Jack sat in his chair, watching them as he sipped his coffee. The smallest cub, as bold as ever, toddled toward him, its tiny paws padding softly against the wooden floor. Jack set his mug aside and crouched, holding out his hand once more. The cub sniffed at his fingers before pressing its cold nose against his palm. "You're going to be in trouble, aren't you?" he said with a grin. He glanced at Luna, who watched the interaction with her usual calm. "Your mom's going to have her hands full with you." The cub let out a soft grunt before retreating to its siblings, its curiosity satisfied for the moment. Jack leaned back in his chair, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time in months, the cabin felt alive. Not just a place to survive the winter, but a home. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jack felt like he belonged. The days turned into weeks, and the snow outside the cabin began to soften under the weak but persistent rays of the late winter sun. Life with Luna and her cubs had settled into a rhythm. Jack woke each morning to their soft sounds, shared his meager supplies with them, and spent his days writing or working around the cabin while the bears rested or explored the surrounding forest. Each moment with them felt like a gift, an unspoken exchange of trust that reminded Jack of the connection he'd thought he'd lost forever. The cubs grew bolder each day, their personalities emerging in small but unmistakable ways. The smallest, whom he'd quietly named Scout, was the curious and often followed him as he went about his tasks. The largest, a more cautious cub, stayed close to Luna, while the middle one seemed to balance between mischief and timidity. It was on a particularly mild afternoon, the snow melting into rivulets that trickled down the slope near the cabin, that Jack noticed the change in Luna. She had become restless, pacing the edges of the cabin and sniffing the air as though searching for something. Her watchful eyes seemed more distant, and her movements carried a purpose he hadn't seen before. "You're thinking about leaving, aren't you?" Jack said softly as he sat on the porch watching her. The cubs tumbled nearby, oblivious to the shift in their mother's demeanor. Luna glanced at him briefly, her dark eyes steady, before resuming her pacing. Jack's chest tightened. He had known this moment would come, had told himself from the beginning that this was only temporary. But the thought of the cabin without them, of the silence that would inevitably creep back in, was harder to face than he'd imagined. That evening, as the last light of day faded into twilight, Jack sat by the fire with his notebook in his lap. The words came slowly, but they came spilling out in a way that felt both cathartic and inevitable. He wrote about Luna and her cubs, about the storm that had brought them together, and the strange, healing connection they had forged in the heart of winter. When he finally set his pen down, the cabin was quiet. The bears were asleep, their breathing soft and rhythmic. Jack leaned back in his chair, staring at the fire as his thoughts wandered. "I'll miss you," he whispered into the stillness, the words carrying more weight than he expected. The next morning, the air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine. The snow had receded enough to reveal patches of earth, and the forest seemed alive with the subtle stirrings of spring. Jack stepped outside with a bundle of food, expecting to see Luna and her cubs near the porch. But they weren't there. His heart sank as he scanned the clearing, his breath catching in his throat. The hollowness he'd once known so well threatened to return, but then he spotted them at the edge of the trees. Luna stood tall, her cubs gathered around her, their small bodies almost lost among the towering pines. Jack hesitated, unsure if he should approach. But then Luna turned, her eyes meeting his from across the clearing. It was a long, steady gaze, one that held 1,000 unspoken words. Gratitude, trust, goodbye. He raised a hand in a silent farewell, his throat tight. "Take care of them," he said, though he knew she couldn't hear him, "and take care of yourself." Luna lingered for a moment longer before turning and leading her cubs into the forest. Jack watched as they disappeared into the trees, their shapes fading into the dappled shadows. When they were gone, the silence returned, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful. Back inside the cabin, Jack sat at his desk, silver-framed photo of Clara catching the morning light. He picked it up, studying her familiar smile, and for the first time, he didn't feel the ache of loss. Instead, he felt a quiet sense of gratitude, as though she had been with him through all of it, guiding him toward the life he had thought he'd lost. He opened his notebook and began to write again, the words flowing easily now. And so, the story comes to an end, but the echoes of trust, resilience, and the bond between humans and nature linger on. Sometimes the most unexpected moments are the ones that change us the most. If this story touched your heart, share it to spread its meaningful message.